I'm an autism awareness angel, making sure my wings protect the different, the stranger than. I'm an autism awareness angel. It's good, cause I'm cool with the unique behavior. I'm an autism awareness angel. Will you accept me? Cause I accept you. I'm an autism awareness angel, cause a view from the spectrum is a better point of view. The question at hand, are you...
Hi, I'm Tally, and welcome back to Autism 30. Once again, we're recording from the beautiful PAFN's Good Life Fitness Hub located in Richmond, British Columbia. And you're listening to the second and final part of the two-part podcast talking with Mr. Keith Landherr from Little Buddies Pediatric Therapy located in Burnaby and Richmond, British Columbia, Canada. Listen and enjoy. Can you please explain sensory integration?
I'll try. So sensory integration is basically how we take information in from the environment and then how our brains make sense of it and then how we use that information to act upon the world. And so what we see often with children with autism is that they'll have sensory processing difficulties where they may be hyper or hyposensitive, which means they either overreact or underreact to any sort of sensation. And so when they overreact, it's usually the easiest one to explain. What happens, at a very early age is that child will put so much more weight to that information that they really won't take the other information and kind of cross-reference it to make like a whole picture and make sense of the world. So we don't really think about this, but when we were walking or running or any of these sorts of things, we take all of this information that comes from our bodies as well as our visual system, from our inner ear, so it can be vestibular, proprioceptive, as well as there's other receptors that tell us how much our muscles have fired and how long they are at any given moment.
Yes.
And many people have varying degrees of all of these capacities. And so we think of athletes as being people who are probably have really integrated sensory systems. And then most of us are somewhere in between.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I think that when, one of the things when we think of like a fun house, the reason why those things work is that they do things to trick your sensory system. And so if you're looking, like the one that always tricked me when I was a kid was the one that there was one where the walls looked like they were really long, but it was actually really short. But they were.
Are those the ones that make you look thin and fat?
No, those are the mirrors, but those are good too. No, these are. It looks like a long hallway, but the everything is angled to look like a long hallway, but it's actually short. And I would go running into the wall because all of the kids want to be first, so they're playing on that part. So you're really not taking the time that might be needed to kind of figure out what's actually happening. And then the sound is also loud that you don't really process that information. So if I were in there by myself and I yelled down the hallway and the sound came back to me really fast, I would know to think again about what I was seeing, or perhaps touch it to see that the angle of the wall wasn't this long straight line, that it was actually angled going downward, from the wall to the ceiling. And that would tell me the hallway is not very long, don't go down that hallway. But instead, I don't really hear that because everyone's yelling, and I go running into the wall.
And so does that mean that people with autism, they get those kind of messages on a daily basis from the typical world around them?
Absolutely. And, there is a saying, it can be too light, too bright, too loud. And what happens is that if you're just focused on that, then you're missing out on quite a bit of other sensory information because we process things through hearing and seeing and touch and our oral motor, our vestibular systems, and then all of those sort of internal body senses. And if we're focused on one, we're not focused on the other. And then the other thing is that every time we wind up having a fail, we tend to get very afraid because the world isn't making sense to us. And so
Absolutely.
the world isn't safe. So therefore, we think, well, I didn't really learn something from that. And because we don't figure out what part we might retain,
Yes.
because we're in fight or flight.
Absolutely. And that's not a pleasant feeling for anyone.
No, and what I think is underestimated as well is that we don't really think of children as having some sort of post-traumatic stress reaction to this, but my experience is that they probably do. It doesn't mean that we can't change it, but and certainly that's one of the reasons why when we were talking before about that relationship piece, why that's so important, because if they feel grounded and like we're going to help them, it's less likely that they're going to have that kind of reaction, and then it's going to make more sense to them. So that's one of the reasons why when the person who created the theory of sensory integration and the test for it, what she did was she padded all of the gym areas, including some of the walls, and made it so that if you do fall, that it may be uncomfortable, you may lose your breath if you land flat on your back or on your stomach, but you won't really be hurt.
So a safe environment.
A safe environment. And so the person who created this theory, her name was Jean Ayres, and she was an OT, but she also had a PhD in educational psychology.
Yes.
And so when you think of that, it makes a lot of sense that she did this. And in many ways, she spent a great amount of time thinking about what the children were reacting to by observing them, and not underestimating it by thinking, well, that shouldn't bother anybody, so therefore that isn't part of the picture. And so if a child had a reaction to sound, or if a parent reported that, then she took that with full weight and then worked on ways to make this better by trying to understand. She also had a profound understanding of neurology.
Yes.
As well. And so she was really amazing at doing these things. And one of the things that she talked about was about being stuck in traffic and how that feels. I like a different analogy better, probably because she practiced in LA and I practiced in New York City, so I really
They're very different. Yes, I agree.
And they do have a train there now, but at the time they didn't have like a mass transit system, and so they're still building one. But in New York, or even on the SkyTrain, if it's really, really crowded, we tend to try to block out as many things as possible. So we may not notice, there may be somebody that we know on the train, and if we don't look up because we're staring and hyper-focusing on something, so that we can tolerate the really loud person who's talking, or the person who's wearing too much perfume, or whatever it is that we find to be noxious, we're not going to notice everything in the train at that time. But the thing that we do is we put up with it because we want to get there.
Yes.
And it may be the fastest way to get there at that time of the day. And so we put up with all of these things so that can happen. But these children, if we put a heart rate monitor on them, we would find that they're probably having a very similar reaction.
Yes.
And they don't look like it necessarily, although if you really look at their eyes, you can see there's a thing called flooding, and or that they withdraw, and that's a that's a key clue that
And I think that what you've mentioned is really highly important in the sense where I get this all the time where, oh, your son looks fine. But I know, because I know him very well, that he's quite traumatized by the situation and he needs to be looked after at that point. And I'm sure there's many other children out there who are... by the average person misdiagnosed in that situation, because many are not fine in that situation. Many are going through their own trauma, but because of the fact that they don't display it as the typical person necessarily would, that the cues are miscommunicated or misinterpreted, so that there's a lot of
misunderstanding.
Thank you. Misunderstanding.
Yeah, I agree, and and it's in many ways it's an invisible occurrence, right? Like we
absolutely,
and they become pretty good at hiding it too, and so all we know is that all of a sudden they're running out of the room, or kind of tapping on their ears, or and in some ways the tapping on the ears is the easy one, right?
Yes.
We tend to know what that is pretty quickly now. Although I think 20 years ago, I don't think everyone understood what that was.
I think 20 years ago there was a lot that wasn't understood.
So the great thing is that we can educate people about what these things look like and what somebody might be experiencing, and that can be quite effective. So when we think like the child is having this reaction or they're staring, hyper-focusing at a spot on the wall,
yes.
Well, then why are they doing that? And the thing is, like, they're on the crowded subway train right now, and
yes.
we're looking around the room and saying, well, this room doesn't look like a subway or a SkyTrain. But yet that's their experience. And
yes.
And so unless we deal with this is their perception, that the reality of that won't change, and it won't change for them. It's an interesting thing that when I moved into British Columbia about 6 years ago, one of the things that was talked about, the great thing about evidence-based treatment is that we can really be kept away from things that are really bad.
Yes.
But there are times when the evidence hasn't caught up with something that may actually be very valuable. And so the language can be here that we'll talk about sensory processing, and almost everyone is fairly comfortable with that. When we start to talk about sensory integration treatment, that can become a little bit uncomfortable for people. So what I often say to people who say that is that, well, most of the sensory processing research has had its nexus from sensory integration research.
Yes.
It would be great if there were bigger studies and the funding for all of these things, so that that can really keep people from this. And the funding is just not there. And so
yes.
one of the things, actually in China, they did a really great study on weighted vest, and they actually interesting and did a study with 300 participants.
And what was the result?
Well, the result was that what they did was they looked at the child's sensory profile. And so what typically happened, or the research that's happened here, in North America, has been that you give a weighted vest to everyone and then you just figure out, whether it works or not. Well, what they did instead was that they looked at the children that were constantly moving around and really needing heavy work, and they put them on these vests on them, and lo and behold, it was quite effective at decreasing many of the behaviors that they were trying to make better.
Interesting.
And then they also gave the same vest, these weighted vests, to kids that were typical and didn't need, wouldn't be somebody we would typically prescribe them to. And lo and behold, the behavior in those children actually got worse.
Interesting.
because it wasn't the right treatment for that sensory processing profile. And so when, the difficult thing about doing this research, the really long story here, is that, for somebody to find 300 children with the same sensory profile, and even in a place like Vancouver, could be pretty hard, because
Yes.
you'd have to have millions and millions of people in order for you to find that population. And so what happens is that the studies can often show that there's a benefit to a majority of the participants, but then when you look at the statistical significance, it's not very high, because in order for that to happen, you would basically have to have it help 100% of the kids, and you would also have, or you would have to have a very, very large number of participants. And one of the mistakes of some of the researchers as well has been that they haven't categorized or looked at the child's sensory profile and then done specific types of treatment for those children, as well as, when we don't handpick the participants. So some of them may be, what we would describe as being severely autistic and have really severe symptoms. And for those children to change might take a year. And most of the studies won't last that long. So we're not really going to get the information that we're really trying to get. So my experience has been that I've been doing this for a very long time.
Yes, 25 years plus. Yes.
25 years plus. And I remember that one of my early supervisors had said that she was doing, she pulled out a swing in the clinic, and it wasn't a very great swing. It was tiny, but it was what we had. And I noticed that her children were getting better, and I was doing a more traditional kind of drill the skill kind of approach, and my child wasn't doing as well as her child. And so I started copying her, and this was before I received any sensory integration training. And lo and behold, that child started to do better. And I thought, all right, and I started looking at it as being a detective about, so what sensory information is not being processed efficiently for this child, and how can we help make that better? And some of it was, really hunt and pack, and it still is. I mean, because every kid is different and will respond differently. But when you figure that out, it can be a quite profound response and difference.
Absolutely. And this is also, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the reasons why you do an assessment with all children before you start treatment.
Absolutely. We try to do a sensory profile on every child. That's one of the things that we do. Actually, we don't try to. We do one on every
Sorry.
child. No.
Correct. Thank you for correcting me.
No,
and now
I'm correcting myself too. But and because when the other thing that happens is that we also learn a lot about the parents' sensory processing style. And so there are times when a parent will complete the survey and the child will come out right at the 50 percentile. And I look at the paper, and I used to not know what that meant, but I know what it means now. It usually means that the parent also has a sensory processing difference as well, which can be quite helpful for them to learn about as well.
Absolutely. And I find it interesting that often sometimes that the traits that the child has, one or two of the parents might have a similar attribute within themselves.
I think that's very true.
And a question that I had, because I know that you do this, and I've heard a lot of positive things about it, is handwriting without tears. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. I mean, Handwriting Without Tears was a handwriting program that was developed by an occupational therapist who worked in schools, I believe in Pennsylvania. And so what she did was that she developed an approach that is multisensory. And the trick about that part is that she didn't intend on every child doing every sensory modality. It was that you could find the sensory modality that worked best for that child and use that method. But what they do is they do some tracing. And I guess I should explain it by talking about one of my favorite techniques that they use, which is called wet, dry, try. And
Interesting. What's that?
It's interesting. It uses a small chalkboard that is very specific. It's made by them, manufactured by them. And it sounds like it would be super, super expensive.
Yes.
I believe it's less than $10.
Wow.
US, but I mean, it used to
Depending on where the Canadian dollar is, it's either good or...
Yeah, but I mean, it's not like it's an outrageous
No, it's not.
amount. And so what they do is they have a little happy face on the one corner. It's double-sided, and it's made to be the right size for the child, so it feels very large for them.
Yes.
And so what the parent would do is using big line, big curve, little curve, forming all the letters, because through those basic shapes we can make any letter.
Yes.
And so to make a B, I would start at the happy face and say big line, little curve, and then give them the tiniest. They actually sell these too, but it's a very small wet sponge. So you wet the sponge and then they erase it
interesting.
using the same method. So it's big line, little curve. So they're learning how to form the letters. They're learning the sequence of the letters. They're also learning how to size them correctly.
Yes.
And not the same size to be on a page, but the sizing becomes consistent.
Yes.
And then we dry it with the tissue. And then what I usually do is that I keep doing this until, they seem like they're really getting it. And I ask them if they're ready to go first or they want me to go first. And if they say that they're ready to go first, I turn the chalkboard over and let them start on their own. And then they do big line, little curve. And before you know it, it does it without a lot of stress. So
That's what I was going to say. It sounds quite playful and an enjoyable experience, not like when I was in school where my teachers would drill me to do handwriting, and even if you were good at it, the whole experience was quite stressful. What sounds like you're describing sounds like play and enjoyment, and the students actually have fun and are gaining the fine motor skills required in the end process of what you're actually trying to do.
Absolutely. And I was one of those children too. And I remember them trying to drill me beyond way longer than it should have lasted. And, finally looking up at them and saying, if I could do that, don't you think I would do it? So you would stop standing over me saying
Yes.
that. And the teacher kind of looked at me at first and then realized that I was probably right, and that there was something happening for me that she wasn't quite understanding. And so then I think that this will happen less. I'm not saying that it won't be a bit harder for some children, but it'll help them to feel really successful and without them feeling like they haven't done it.
And this sounds like an excellent program for typical children as well, it sounds like to me.
Absolutely, and it works through what would be really normal development. At the same time, it helps them to realize that there's a reason for writing. Like the workbooks are, again, they're also, they're not free,
Yes.
but they're certainly not some outrageously expensive program either.
Absolutely. Now I want to move on to something called SOS, Sequential Oral Sensory. Can you please tell us what that is and what it entails and how it works?
Sure. I mean, it's based on looking at what foods would be sequentially next for the child. So they try to start out with their safe foods.
Yes.
And so then if they are, it can be based on color or size or shape, and believing that again, they probably want to eat things that you want them to eat, but they're having trouble with it.
Because I know food issues is a common problem, I would say, for a lot of our kids.
Oh, absolutely. And so that if they only want to eat green foods, well, what other green food can you get them to eat?
Yes.
And so that you slowly build on that experience, and then looking at what oral issue might be happening for them as well. I mean, they can have hyposensitivity of touch in their mouth,
Yes.
and they can have hyposensitivity as well. And neither of them is actually very good, because
Yes.
one, you might gag too fast, and if you have hyposensitivity, then you can't actually figure out where you left the food, and
Yes.
therefore you can't get it down into your belly.
Yes, and I know other food issues that arise. I know with my son, he can actually distinguish the difference between two brands of crackers, which in my opinion look exactly the same. So when you're talking to children or your clients who have issues with food, how would you help them to I hate the word get over because that is not an appropriate term, but how would you ease the transition to facilitate them eating a more variety of foods?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to look at whether or not they're receiving adequate nutrition based on their diet. And,
Yes.
And so if that's true, then that's great, because then we have an easier time, because we can decrease some of the anxiety in
Yes.
the room. Actually, I have a nephew who, until he was 12 years old, only ate hot dogs. He
Okay.
was supposedly typically developing, but would only eat hot dogs, and it was a specific brand of hot dogs. And I can tell you, he eats everything now, and he's
That's great news for all of us out there who are having this issue.
but I mean, it's not everyone has that experience either, and so with children, if we can figure out, like, so sometimes if it's an oral sensitivity, there are ways that we can figure out without bringing food into it to desensitize them in terms of their oral motor capacity, so that that's not happening.
Yes.
And then working on being really playful with food, whether it's getting them to touch the food, whether it's to give it a kiss, or often they find it really funny if you do something silly with the food, like put a pea on your nose. With
Yes.
some parents that may be very, they may be very opposed to that, because we're taught not to play with food. But the great thing about that approach is that it's very disarming. So suddenly,
Yes.
it's not this thing I'm going to try to stick into your mouth and force you to eat. It's something I've put on my nose and I'm being silly with, and therefore maybe if it's unharmful for me to put on my nose, then maybe it's not so harmful for you to actually eat.
Absolutely. And I love that approach too, because I know around the dinner table, I know there's so many rules and regulations about proper etiquette and the things that you do and don't, and there seems to be quite a huge stress between parents sitting at the dinner table to being out in public at a restaurant, and I think some kids feel that stress, and to be playful, as you're suggesting with food, I think adds another a calming effect to kids. Am I wrong in that?
No, I really like what you're saying. And whether it's with food or whether it's saying thank you or please, I think that one of the things that we do is we see a lot of people who say, they'll say, ball, and say, please ball. And I'm thinking, like, well, first of all, like, the child has just communicated and you've said, you're not a successful communicator. It's not enough, again. As well as the fact that I say to parents, you're a very polite person.
Yes.
And so he's got a lot of time to figure that out. And
I had somebody say, don't force the please and thank you on my child, that over time they'll pick it up. And I remember at the time thinking, but I want my child to be so well-mannered. But I listened, and she was absolutely right. My child does say please and thank you, and it's not forced. And I allowed myself to trust in the process, and the process, as you're saying, is correct. It does work. So I absolutely agree. And one of the things that I've loved that you've mentioned throughout this podcast are the parents. And you ask for information from the parents and you get feedback from the parents. And the parents seem to be very involved and work as a team in collaboration with you. How are the parents involved in the whole process, in your opinion?
Well, I think that the parents are really key. There are parents who want to drop the child off and go into the waiting room, and that's fine too. We encourage parents to come in and be in the session with us. And I mean, if they're comfortable. If they're not comfortable, that's a different thing too. But I'm with the child for an hour, and the parent
Yes.
is with them all week long.
Very true.
And so that it's just really imperative that they learn from the experience, and you learn a lot more by just observing and interacting than if I say, hey, do this. Whereas I've modeled what engagement might look like, and for you to say, hey, I might try that too, or even not thinking about it, because then it may even just come out as an automatic response from you, and then if it works, you're going to keep using
Very
that
true.
kind of technique.
Now, do you visit people in their homes, or do you only offer services at your 2 locations?
We do visit children in their homes. I myself, if a parent wants only home-based services, I myself am not available because of I also am helping to run the clinic and doing all of that sort of thing. So
You're a very busy man.
I am, and so we do have people who will do that kind of work. Sometimes we encourage parents to come into the clinics because there's a lot of specialized equipment that they may not have in their home that can be really effective at helping their child. Most parents, when they do have that experience, figure out a way to make that happen.
Yes.
But we are very sensitive to the fact that not everyone can do that. And so we try to find a way to do that. And even if they do come into the clinic as their primary point of service, we try to visit the home so that we can see what that looks like.
So you can have a better idea.
Absolutely. We visit the schools, we go to IEP meetings, we do all of those sorts of things.
Actually, because that was my next question, because I know many of us, when we get to a point, our children are at school or preschool and whatnot, and you do work with schools and educational institutions.
No, absolutely.
And that's great. For those of you that don't know what an IEP is, an individual education plan is something that's given to our students upon entering school, which you have the complete right to not only yourself attend, but have whoever you want there present to attend at those meetings. And you basically just said, Keith, that you do attend those meetings if the parents require you to.
Yes, we do. And so in some of this, we do work with some of the home schools as well. So
Oh, that's great news.
there are parents who are homeschooling and then come for OT. Sometimes we go to the home for those children, but many of them will come into the clinic once a week because it also gives those kids some time for socialization. We don't necessarily see them as a dyad, but we try to pair them so that there's another child who is similar, who
Yes.
may be working with another therapist, so that they can have that kind of interaction. And often if they're homeschooled, part of that reason can be because they are having trouble with these social interactions.
Yes.
So they need the 2 adults to scaffold it and kind of make it happen.
And that must be really educational for you to get a better idea of the child that you're working with, so that you're not dealing with them in only a clinical setting, you're dealing with them in a real world setting to better help.
Absolutely. I mean, there are children that I see, and just because of scheduling, will be coming in by themselves and no one else is in the clinic, and all of a sudden that a few weeks later there's 2 other children and 2 therapists in the room. And I say, oh my gosh, now I know what the mom is talking about.
Absolutely. And basically what you're mentioning, correct me if I'm wrong, the correct term is a social group, because I know you also offer camps and social groups. So does that encompass what we're talking about, or is that something completely separate?
It's related, but it's something separate. So the social
Okay.
groups will tend to be, and we do dyads where one therapist will work with two children at the same time. We tend not to start those. We try to get the parents started with one-to-one services first,
Yes,
and then
of
it's
course.
a progression. And so the dyads, we try to, like, or we call them paired sessions, where we try to pair up two children, but they each have their own therapist. But then when we have social groups, we have, it's usually 3 to 2, or, depending on the grouping, it can be a 2 to 1, but there's three therapists and 6 children.
Yes.
So there sometimes is a very high adult to child ratio, but there's more children in the room at that time.
And in your social groups, do you offer them all year round, or are there special times of when they happen?
Yes, we do. We do offer them year round. We tend to offer some more during the summer, but they're not just during the summer. And so there's one social group that will run for 6 weeks, and then there's a 2-week break, and then there's at the same time, and some of the children will sign up for the next session.
Okay, so kind of like mini camps.
Absolutely,
But they're not camps. They're a continuation of the work being done throughout the year. They're just more focused and centralized.
yes, they are, and they're focused on using the floor time model. So we're working on having that child increase their functional emotional capacities within that group. And so it's nice because there are some kids that will, kind of rotate out and then come back. And what happens is that depending on the mix, that child's kind of presses will be, happen, and they'll have to work through something as well as be supported through something. And it's always interesting that there are children that you would never think would really gel together,
Yes.
and it works unbelievably beautifully. There are some times when children will have challenges with another child, but I can tell you that I often see, there's one child in particular that I'm thinking of that I saw after this was over, and when he came back in was in a dyad, he was remarkably more advanced than he was before the group.
And it's always good to challenge kids with other people, because really throughout life we meet all different kinds of people, and different people that we meet will bring out something different in all of us. So to expose our children to different people, I think, is a very healthy and positive thing, because that can only help everyone grow.
Absolutely, I agree.
So what are the maximum and minimum ages of the people that you work with?
The minimum age of anyone I've ever worked with is probably about 3 days old.
Wow.
But in British Columbia, because of the funding, especially for children on the spectrum, that you have to be diagnosed first. The children tend to be about 2 to 2.5.
Yes.
I'm very comfortable working with children who are younger. The oldest person I've ever worked with was actually in their 60s, but in terms of children at the center, it tends to be about 18 years old, unless they have a profound delay, and we're seeing them in their 20 years old, but developmentally a little bit younger.
Yes, and so what's the cost of the services? Because I know by the time they're 18 years old, they're given money from the British Columbia government, from the Autism Funding Unit. So does the cost match the funding that are given, or how does that work?
Well, there's probably not enough funding for what many of the children need.
No question, and I couldn't have said it any better. What are the cost of your services?
Well, the cost for us are the standard, which is $120 per hour.
Correct,
And
that
so,
is standard.
So depending on what type of evaluation or whether it's report writing, it's all based on that hourly rate.
And can you use the funding given to you by the British Columbia government from the Autism Funding Unit for your services?
Yes, you can. We also accept at-home funding for those children who have trouble with what they call, the big three, which is toileting, feeding, and ADLs.
They are the big three, I agree.
So
And I mean, speaking with you today has been a really real joy. I've learned an awful lot of information myself. But can you tell me in your own words what success stories you have that you'd like to share?
Well, I'm the one that I would think of was someone who the child actually was 2 when I met him, and he, started coming along. He would spend a lot of his time just on a tricycle, not talking to other children, not interacting very much, and hoping that other people would chase him around, and that was pretty much it. And, I'd been working with him for about 2 months, and his mom called me and said, my son hugged me today, and then she started crying.
Lovely.
And I said, oh, that's really nice. He hugged you today. And she said, I don't think you really understand. He's never hugged me before.
God, that's beautiful.
And yes,
I'm feeling verklempt myself.
and that's exactly what Lori would say too. She loves that word. And so, if you can find a way for the parent to have some joy with their child and have a little bit of what that mom that they had kind of hoped and dreamed about, that's really the best that could ever happen for any of us.
And I completely agree. And it's clear to me that you actually really understand what parents want from their children, and you're really facilitating that happening with your clients. So parents must be overjoyed.
Absolutely. And he's actually on his way to engineering school this year. So
fantastic.
Amazing. Yeah.
Congratulations. That sounds fantastic. And what do you love about your work? It's obvious to me, but what do you?
Well, I really like children, and I really like them knowing that somebody cares about them, and I really like them feeling powerful and strong and like they can be kind of successful or conquerors of their own universe, because that's so important. I mean, if you can feel like you can conquer that, then hopefully that will mean something nice for you, and you don't actually mean it in a negative way, especially given the climate we live in nowadays. But
Yes.
that it means, creating a world where you care about each other and that you can do things that you find to be important and take care of your loved ones. And that's really what it should all be about.
I agree, and that's beautiful. And really, you stated that so lovely. And to close off the interview, which I'm really sad to be ending because I feel I'm learning a lot from you sitting here, but what would you like the world to know about autism?
Well, I think that what I really want people to know about autism is that they really need to think about the child as an individual, and including that, that we really have to respect neurodiversity, that we're all different, whether we're, have a label of being on the spectrum or not, and that what we're going to find that child's best self by really embracing that and allowing them to be who they might be, and finding, what that means for them, and then finding a way for them finding a way to educate the world so that they can do that. And there's a guy, I think his name is Ari Neiman from the SANS. He runs that organization in Washington, D.C. And so it's for adults on the spectrum who are advocating for themselves. And he talks quite a bit about that, and it's really eloquent, and it's just really wonderful. And I truly believe that. I hope the best for everyone, and I don't mean to sound like a Pollyanna, like everyone is going to be going off to college and doing all of these amazing things, but we can at least hope that they can be the best that they can be without being perhaps less of a burden if their parents feel like they're a burden right now, and at least live in the least restrictive environment possible for them when they become older.
Yes.
Because it's, even if you're, someone who's really worried about the cost in government, it costs less to have less support for a child who can
There's
do that.
no question, and the research proves it.
Yeah.
And you know what? Listening to you speak and the way you speak about our children is, we're so grateful that you've chosen this line of work to work with our kids, because I know one of the beautiful things in the way that you describe it is what you're talking about is working with the individual child and helping facilitate them to have more ease with the world around them, but not destroying who they are as individuals, and maintaining their dignity, their self-worth, and building up their confidence. So not only will they hopefully have the physical and psychological skills to move forward, but feel good about themselves as individuals and to value their own individuality. So I want to thank you very much for spending the time with us today, because many of you out there that you've learned as much as I have in this interview, and I'm really grateful that you've spent this time with us today.
You're very welcome. I'm so glad you had me as well, and thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. That concludes our podcast with Keith Landherr from Little Buddies Pediatric Therapy, located in Burnaby and Richmond, British Columbia, Canada. And if you're listening to us on iTunes, don't forget to click and write a review. Your reviews really help ensure that Autism 30 continues to stay at the top of the autism list on iTunes, and we really value your support. Once again, this is Tally telling you to live in love.
Hey yo, I'm an autism awareness angel, making sure my